Well, welcome again to everyone and to everyone watching online on our online communities. Don't forget that you can log on to the sermon notes via the YouVersion app. If you want to do that, go to YouVersion app, click the three little lines for more, and then go to events, look for Westside Church of Christ, and all of the sermon notes will be there. Otherwise, they'll be in your Whitehill News. I asked the question in the church paper editorial, what if people in history had made different decisions about things? History would be quite different. Sometimes there's events that change the course of history. And if a decision was made differently, history as we know it would be totally the opposite. Consider a guy called Stanislav Petrov. He was a commander at the Russian nuclear missile early defense warning system. And one day, as he was doing his duties, the alarm went off, saying that America had launched a nuclear missile at Russia. Next thing he knew, 5 alarms went off, saying that 5 missiles were on the way. And he had a choice to make. Would he tell his superiors and launch a counterattack and have a full-blown nuclear war against America? If he waited, he could be putting his country in danger. But he decided to wait. Rightly, fortunately. Not too many people know about this thing, but later on, an investigation confirmed that there was a malfunction in the system. And if he had acted, there would have been war. But there wasn't. In the same way, in the early church, there was a decision made that I don't think really even too many Christians know a lot about. But it changed the course of history for the church. If it didn't happen, maybe we wouldn't have the church as we know it today around the world. And it's a principle behind that I believe we've got to wrestle with in our church today if we're going to have a positive future going forward. So let me explain. We begin at the end of Jesus' life and ministry on earth. After he'd risen again, he commanded his disciples with the sort of commanding officer's words, which we call the Great Commission. In Matthew 28:18, he said, Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." So Jesus' final words, his marching orders to the disciples, were to make more disciples by baptizing them and teaching them to obey all the things that Jesus did and taught, including the command to make disciples. And then it happened. To the Jews that were gathered for a big festival about 7 weeks and 1 day after the events of the resurrection, Peter explained the full significance of what was going on. He explained that Jesus had died for their sins. And they repented. And 3,000 were baptized that very first day. All these Jews from right around who had gathered for this special festival. And then, as they say today, it spread, it went viral. Then there was 3,000, then there was 5,000. And then it spread around the world. And then it went not just to Jews who were steeped in Jewish tradition and religion. It went to the Samaritans, who were sort of a racial half-caste between Jews and Gentiles. And then it went to full-blown Gentiles, people who lived far away from the center of all this in Jerusalem, who were far away from God in their own way, far away from the Jewish traditions in thinking and in practice. But they embraced Jesus as well. And they were totally and utterly convinced in the lordship of Jesus, in who he was and what he stood for, that he died and rose again, and therefore everything that he said was true. And even though all these people were far away, they were just as enthusiastic and just as genuine in their love for Jesus as this early group. And they had communities that popped up called churches, and they were communities of faith and love. And they loved one another as no one had really seen ever before in the Roman Empire. Now, I've just done a spread of about 20 or 30 years of church history, the first 14 chapters of Acts. But by chapter 15, something comes up. It was an issue that was brewing that was so important that needed a decision. Now, this is what it's about. Acts 15 verse 1 says, certain people came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers, unless you are circumcised according to the customs taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. So this was a big issue, and what it boiled down to is that the Jews that were really the first to accept the gospel, the question was, do you have to become a Jew before you become a Christian? Because that's the way it seemed to work. Certainly to the Jews. They were steeped in the Jewish traditions and everything like that. And they had a life steeped in this idea that God's will revolved around them. And in one sense it did for many years. And they had trouble, a lot of them, believing that God would then include all these other types of people into the centre of his will. That you could just bypass them and include Gentiles. So they thought it must have been, no, these guys are, they've got a sidetrack somewhere. They've got to become Jews first. So they argued, in their mind, I think fairly logically, that no, you had to be Jew before you were Christian, because that's the way it worked with them. You had to follow the Jewish religion, and then you could embrace Jesus. It was, that was the way it happened for them. Go to Sabbath school, learn the 10 Commandments, give up ham and prawns because they were out of unclean animals. And guys, you've got to be circumcised. So this caused a real dilemma for the church because you had people literally lining up to get into the churches. They'd never seen anything like it. They were in awe of the things that were happening. These people loved each other, as I said, like they'd never seen before. They respected who Jesus was, that he taught a God of love, not some of their gods that were so fickle you never knew where you stood with them, but God of love who loved them at all times. But you got these guys, and we're doing a newcomers class in a couple of weeks' time. We'll announce about that in the next couple of weeks. But I can imagine these guys, they're out in their chariot in the chariot park. And this guy says, honey, I love Jesus. I'm here for the new members class. I really love what the church stands for. But this guy, Uzziah, whatever his name is, he's telling me I've got to become a Jew before I become a Christian. I've got to give up ham. I love my ham for Christmas. I've got to give up my prawns. I love my prawns. Get them down there. And they want me to be circumcised. I really got to think about this, honey. You go into the class, you're fine, but I've got to think about whether I'm going to commit to this because it's a big decision for me. Verse 2. So this idea brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. So Paul and Barnabas were appointed along with some of the other believers to go to Jerusalem and to see the apostles and elders about this question. Now this is an issue for Paul, and he vehemently disagreed with this approach. Now, he was a Jew, but there was no one more Jewish than Paul. He was brought up as a rabbi. He was a great teacher. But in his conversion to Christianity, he embraced that he was going to be the apostle to all the nations. In fact, at one stage, he had another argument with Peter, because Peter, as a Jew, had started preaching to the Gentiles and even started meeting with them, going into their houses and having meals with them. And some of the Jews said, you shouldn't do that because they're unclean people. So Peter had pulled back from them, and Paul and Peter had a bit of an argument about this. And Paul had to point out, what he was doing was wrong, that God was including these people, indeed, in his plan for the world. And it shows that even for someone like the Apostle Peter, old habits die hard. They're hard to break. Even, this is 30 years. This is the sort of attitude that Peter had with him for all this time, but only recently had come around to accept that Gentiles were fully included in God's plan and that he could associate with them as a Christian. Now you have to realise it was a ridiculously long journey to deal with something like that. Paul and Peter thought it was sorted. But here they are, probably up to 500 kilometres away, on a missionary journey where they're planting churches and talking to the already established churches and building them up. And they had to stop this in order to go back to Jerusalem. And you can't just jump in a car in those days, obviously. And it was difficult to leave everything and do this. But they considered it so important because so much was at stake with this issue. And it wasn't an unusual thing for the church to have these gatherings. It's not like we have an AGM that's coming up for us at Kenmore in a couple of weeks' time. But it was significant enough for them to gather the key people there to sort this out. Verse 3. So the church sent them on their way, and they travelled through Phoenicia and Samaria and told how the Gentiles had been converted. The news made all the believers very glad. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and elders, to whom they reported everything God had done through them. Then, I want you to read this carefully. Then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, "The Gentiles must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses." Now, I don't know if you know anything significant there or know the history of Jesus, but one of the things, and I read this a couple of years ago, and it really stood out to me. Here's a group, the church is gathering together, but who's the first group that speaks out? The group of the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees were the people that Jesus had the most trouble with in his ministry, who didn't believe him at all. But here they are, they're included in the church. So there must have been a group of Pharisees who had been converted. And you can imagine the story. Someone goes for a holiday. "Oh, how you going, Abraham? How you going? Good. You want to come to the synagogue with me on the Sabbath?" No, I'm a Christian now. "I thought you're a Pharisee. You had the most trouble with Jesus." Yeah, but I said, look, I wouldn't believe him until he died and rose again. Well, what happened? He died and rose again. So here's this bunch of Pharisees that Jesus had the most trouble with, who are now in the church. But again, same sort of issues, same sort of attitude. They'd embraced Jesus, but Moses was also the guy. He was important. You've got to start with Moses. And they were requiring people to go through the law, do all that, before they came to Jesus. Verse 6. The apostles and elders then met to consider this question. After much discussion, bun fight, church fight, whatever, Peter got up and addressed them. "Brothers, you know that some time ago God made a choice among you that the Gentiles should hear from my lips the message of the gospel and believe." So he's talking about a bit of his history, what he went through. "God, who knows the heart, showed that he accepted them by giving the Holy Spirit to them just as he did to us. He didn't discriminate between us and them, for he purified their hearts by faith. Now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of the Gentiles a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors have been able to bear? No, we believe it's through the grace of our Lord Jesus that we are saved, just as they are." So even Peter gets up and says, "Look, guys, you want the Gentiles to do this? You're not even very good at it yourself. You're having troubles obeying this law, and you want the Gentiles to do it? We're not good at it. Our whole ancestors haven't been good at it. Why would you require this?" Verse 13. When they finished, James spoke up. "Brothers," he said, "listen to me." Do you get who this is? This is James, the brother of Jesus. The brother of Jesus. part of the family of Jesus who, in Jesus' life and ministry for such a long time, didn't believe that he was the Messiah. Wanted to have him committed, thought he was mad, thought he had some sort of mental illness because he was going around calling himself God. Couldn't be trusted. James now, key leader in the church. Because it's a big thing to have a brother or a sister like that. I think I've said this before, and I'll probably say it again because I think it's a good point. If you have a brother or sister, what would it take for them to convince you that they were the Messiah? Some of them already act as if they're God to you. Some of them try to boss you around. But this is James, who was unconvinced until the death and resurrection, until those events came and he became a leader in the church. And when he did stand up to speak and say, listen, they listened because he was convinced. And this is what he said, and you can read the other parts if you want to read in the Bible, but I want to just get to the conclusion, which is so important. Verse 19. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for Gentiles who are turning to God. That was it. That was the decision. That was the conclusion. We should not make it difficult. I think some people haven't got that memo and think, oh yes, let's make it as difficult as we can. Basically, he was saying, let's not put an unnecessary burden on top of these Gentiles who are turning to God. Let's make it easy as we can. Yes, they still have to live with the Jews, and if you read the whole thing, there's one or two things that they're required to do, and some stuff from sexual nature. But basically he's saying, let's make it as easy as possible for those who are turning to Jesus. And we'll write to them, we'll write a letter. And this is the crossroads. This is the fork in the road that says, will we go one way or will we go another? And I really believe if they'd chosen to go the other way, we might not be around. No, the gospel is exclusive. You have to be a Jew first. And that guy out there in the chariot park who's wrestling with it's going, no, it's right. I don't think I can do that. I'd love to come to Jesus, but I don't know if I can get there with all these things first. And maybe the Gentiles would have wholesale rejected this. Now, we know God had it in hand and he had wise people to make these choices. But I really believe that this was a key moment for the life of the early church. But it didn't happen like that. It said, let's make it easy. And the gospel spread even further and wider. And it spread to places it had never been before. And they reached out to people with non-Jewish backgrounds more and more. And they changed their approach and their outlook because of that decision. And they said, you don't have to go to Sabbath school. You don't have to know all the stories. You don't have to recite the 10 Commandments. You don't have to give up ham. You don't have to give up prawns. And guys, you don't have to be circumcised if you don't want to be. And they embraced the gospel. And they changed their approach. And it was grace that they preached and not the law. And it was Jesus and the death and resurrection that was the focus. And that was the message. And the gospel spread and the church grew. And this is what we have to wrestle with today. Because even though that was a specific issue on the Jews and the Pharisee group of Christians and circumcision and all that, I believe it's a principle behind that we have to embrace in the church if we are going to have a positive future. How do we make it easy for people who want to turn to God? Because it's already tough, isn't it? I mean, at Christmas we'll hear, kid born in manger saves the world. Jewish carpenter who lived 2,000 years ago is the Son of God. That's tough. It's tough to maintain our faith when there's all sorts of things going on. But how do we make it easy? How do we follow what James's conclusion is? Not water down the gospel, Not go to the lowest common denominator and chuck out a whole lot of stuff. But how do we remove the obstacles, the man-made obstacles, the unnecessary obstacles, to explain it as clear and concise and as compelling as we can? And I'd love to have conversations with people around those ideas. Paul had already started to address this in some of the letters that he wrote to some of the churches. One I want to talk about now from 1 Corinthians 14. From the Message version, it says this: if you come together as a congregation and some unbelieving outsiders walk in on you as you're all praying in tongues, unintelligible to each other and to them, won't they assume you've taken leave of your senses and get out of there as fast as they can? But if some unbelieving outsiders walk in on a service where people are speaking God's truth, plain words, and that will bring them up against the truth and probe their hearts. Before you know it, they're going to be on their faces before God, recognizing that God is among you. A couple of things I want you to notice from that passage there. Even in the early church there, Paul assumes that there will be people in our gatherings, in our church services, that are not believers. And I think we've got to assume that too. We've got to assume, so if you're here as one of those people, we're drawing back the curtains. We're telling you on the inside what we're about. But we've got to assume all the time, and I've talked to our worship leaders, and in time I'd love to get around to everyone who's involved in public ways in our service to say, how do you speak in such a way that you include people without a faith who are, in various versions, have different names, unbelievers or outsiders or people without faith, people who aren't part of the church family yet? How do we speak to them to include them? I read about this approach a couple of years ago in my previous church, and I changed the way I preached. I didn't make a big song and dance about it, but I was always sort of aware of it. But I was much more aware to include people without that sort of faith in what I'm saying. Then along comes Wayne. I want you to give a big West Side welcome to Wayne for me. Can I have that? Wayne's specially dressed up for the occasion too, so appreciate that. He's got his good thongs on today.
Thanks, Daryl. Daryl did notice my thongs, yes. I said Jesus wouldn't mind.
No, that's right. He wore sandals though, so anyway. So tell the folks at home, where did we first meet? How long ago?
1996, or just before I met Daryl. He married Karen and I. We were going to another church out where we live at Mutterpilly, and that particular minister was moving on to Tasmania, and we were put on to Daryl to say, go and see Daryl in Ipswich and he might marry you. And my wife has been a Christian all her life. She's grown up in the church. I had not, so I'd not ever declared that I was a Christian, and I'll stand here at the time of marrying Karen, I still hadn't declared that, and I know you and I had a number of sessions before we got married. And
yep. So that was good. We got married, you enjoyed that, and you loved that so much, you didn't come back to church for how long?
18 years.
There you go. So that was great. But one day at Whitehill, this lovely young couple rocked in again, and Wayne says, you remember me? Of course I did not. But you had photos of the wedding, didn't you?
Yes, I did, yep.
You haven't got them today, have you?
No, no.
That's good. No. We both changed a bit then. So what were you going through there to come back to church? Because you hadn't been very much at Mutterpilly either, and
no, we hadn't.
Rocked into Whitehill. So what was going on for you to come back?
Karen's mum got an illness that we're still dealing with some 4 years later. That was we're about a year into that time of caring for Karen's mum, and she was dissolving in front of Karen's eyes, and I didn't know what to do. I could answer Karen's call for support, and I could do everything that she required, and I was the rock for her, I gather, but I could see what I could offer wasn't enough, and so the only thing I could think of was, well, I'll look up this old mate that married us in 1996. So I actually Googled Daryl's name and found that he was still at the church in Ipswich. And it was just a Wednesday of that week, a year into managing with Karen's mum. I said, we're going to church on Sunday, champion. And Karen cried, obviously, and then we walked in and met Daryl on that first Sunday, what he's talking about. So that's where the story was up to then.
Okay, so you start coming to church. But the thing that I wanted in our conversations later on, there was stuff going on for you when you're in church. And I want you to talk to people about what that was initially. It was
surreal, to be honest with you, because you got to remember, I did go to church for a while as a lot younger man with Karen, but it was I was just in the motion, and that very bit you put on about the talking in tongues. I can remember we went to a church invited by somebody else, and they were talking in tongues that evening too. And exactly like your message, I found that confronting. So we stopped, didn't go there. But when I turned up all that time later, and I thought I would do the same thing. Oh, I'm here for Karen. I'll just sit beside Karen. But as I sat in the church and the people who stood up here like everyone else does and starts talking, all of a sudden I started looking, are these people talking to me? Is this just me in this room? So it became a real personal thing for me, and I started to really take more interest in Jesus and the stories were told about Jesus. And
so you felt everything that everyone said, including me, was like directed at you.
Absolutely. I thought I was the only one in the room. It was a real fascinating experience, and I can only say, like you people who are Christians would, I felt the Holy Spirit. I could feel it. I could feel something going on that was surreal, and I didn't understand at the time. It took me some time before I got baptised, which I did eventually about 14 months later, didn't I, as you would be aware. And it took a number of times for me to have chats with Daryl about it. And look, I'm still very much a baby in the woods at this caper, but I really love the message, and I love coming and listening to people talk about it. And it's really grabbed me. And I try to incorporate it in my everyday life. Any opportunity I get a chance to discuss Jesus to anybody I run in today, without imposing it, I try to get an opportunity to see in the conversation where I can break into it.
Wayne's the most natural evangelist. His mum's in a home now. I remember him saying that one of the nurses said, "Oh, you're really good with your mum." And Wayne just naturally says, "Oh yeah, I met this guy last year. It just changed my life. He's Jesus." He's just so natural in the way he speaks. So it was really God getting your attention as you came back, and I just thought it was a great practical example of that verse.
Well, thanks for letting me stand in front of you and tell you the story. And I really do passionately love talking about Jesus to people, but I'm also very mindful of the fact it can be imposing and confronting to people. So I might talk to half a dozen people at work and not get the opportunity to bring it into a conversation, but when I can find to bring in my own example, I well and truly, because what I get from coming to these places to listen to these stories, I wish it for everyone else.
Yeah, good on you. Thanks, Wayne. So that's an example of, what I was talking about. Bonnie and I went kayaking on Monday on the Queen's birthday holiday, which is good fun, along the Brisbane River. River Life is a company that hires out kayaks, and we were pretty inexperienced with that, and it was good fun to go along the river. We're supposed to keep within 10 metres of the shore, but of course you're dealing with the wash from the city cats, the jet skis that go past at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and of course our own inability to paddle straight. Bonnie was hitting rocks and I was out in the middle. The GPS tracking would have been really interesting to see what straight path or not that we went, because you're facing all your own forces of paddling too hard on one side and the external forces as well. I just got a picture of this drift that it's so easy for any group, for any organisation, any person, any church to suffer this mission drift as well. That even though you've got a destination, you've got a marching orders from Jesus to make disciples, there's a whole lot of external forces, there's a whole lot of internal ones in our own lives that are forcing us to drift away from where we need to be, to make it more complicated. One drift is from a passion for outsiders to just pacifying insiders. And churches can do this when initially and in those early stages, talk about church plans. I've talked to people here in the early stages here, and there's a passion to reach out, to reach people who don't have a faith. But once you get established, we've got our own needs, we need to be looked after. And there is that as well. But if you just have one and not the other, we're not taking Jesus' words seriously. We go from advancing the mission, a drift from advancing the mission, to just preserving the traditions. We've got to be careful we're not like those early Christian Pharisees. That the way it was for us is the way it has to be for everyone else. The way we came to faith is the way it has to be for someone else. Whereas today, the pathway could be very different, even though the destination might be the same to Jesus. And there will be times where we have to work out in better ways what's going to make it easier for people to be disciples. When people like Wayne come in, how are we going to do that? And to, I guess, summarise a summary that I've come up with, that being a disciple involves making it easier for people who are turning to God so that they can be taught to obey what Jesus said about being a disciple, which involves making it easier for people who are turning to God so that they can be taught how to obey what Jesus taught about making disciples, etc. Now, I've got a whole lot of questions here, and it's in your notes. Really a whole lot of questions with, and they're not the sort of things that, to me, we sort of get the answer for and then can go on to something next week. These are questions to wrestle with. And we might disagree on the answers, and we might disagree on whether that's a valid question. But if you've got answers on these, if you've got opinions, I'd love to have a chat. Do people in our community know that Westside Church of Christ exists? If they don't know, how are they going to find out? How do we make it easier for them to know? If they do know that at least we exist, do they know what we exist for? Or they just know what we are against? How do we tell them what we exist for? And do we really know what we exist for? Even if they know, even if they do know those things, if people in the community are not coming, why not? How will they find their way here? What will make it easier for them to come? Do we want them to come? When they come, what will make it easier for them to connect with the church? What's going to make it easier for them to connect with God and have a testimony like Wayne that God is getting his attention even though he was someone far away from God? As I said, I don't necessarily have answers. I'd love to have the discussion. I've got some ideas though, some things that we want to put in place because they're big what-if questions. What if we don't do this? So for the next two series, for the parable series and for the Christmas series, I've got some flyers printed. You can take some now, they're in the foyer. You can put them up on your own fridge, at least you know when stuff is happening, what sermons we're going to preach on. But that might be an opportunity to give to your friends and neighbours. And when the series is on, I'll have a Facebook and Instagram post about each of the messages. We're going to set up an Instagram page for Westside. And my daughter, who works in social media, she's putting some stuff together, and encourage you to go onto the page, like it, to share it, to to get the social media out there. It'll be for the ones upcoming, up to the Sunday, to encourage people along. And then after the Sunday, we're going to put some stuff up on there as well to point people back to the sermon that they might have missed. So even if they're interested in coming and want to check it out, because often online is the place that people will go to first before they actually commit to go to church. So we'll put some stuff connecting them with what the message has been, pointing them towards the website so they can listen to it and hopefully come the next week. So I'd love that to be part of our strategy, that you become part of that solution as well as we wrestle with the final conclusion of James. That we make that, an unofficial motto. How do we make it easier for people who are turning to God? How do we take the obstacles out of the way? How do we make it less difficult? Let's pray. Father, thank you for that decision in the early church that paved the way for us Gentiles, far away from Israel, far away from Jerusalem, far away from being a Jew. That decision paved the way for the gospel eventually to come to us, so far away in kilometres and in time. And Lord, that decision has driven so many people over the years. Even as I was thinking as Steve was talking, the people who brought the friend to Jesus, they made it easier. They just didn't drop him at the door and said, it's up to you. They made it easier by digging a hole in the roof and laying him at Jesus' feet. And we want to do that with our friends. Help us to wrestle with this idea of how we make it as easy as possible for people to come to faith, to grow in faith, not to make it complex or complicated, but to embrace the simple power of following Jesus, walking in the power of the Spirit, looking to you, Lord, as our Heavenly Father. You've been faithful to us. Lord, help us to be faithful to you in the way that we do the task that Jesus has called us to. We pray it in his name. Amen.